If you loved me, you'd put the deed in my name and kick Eric out, my stepmom told my dad at Thanksgiving. He nodded, but the house was really mine because mom left it to me. So I kicked them both out. Hey everyone, I need to get this off my chest because what happened at Thanksgiving dinner completely changed my life. And honestly, I'm still processing it all. I 28 male, and this story involves my dad Elliot, 52 male, my stepmom Diane, 45 female, and her kids Tyler, 19 male, and Madison, 17 male. It's going to be long, but trust me, it's worth the read. To understand why this Thanksgiving became such a nuclear event, I need to take you back to when I was a kid. My mom Sarah passed away from cancer when I was 15. Those first 15 years of my life were honestly perfect. Mom and dad had this amazing relationship, and our house was always filled with laughter, music, and the smell of mom's incredible cooking. Mom wasn't just a great cook. She was this brilliant woman who worked as a financial advisor and had incredible instincts about investments and property. While dad worked as a mechanic and made decent money, it was mom who really built our family's wealth. She bought our house when I was 7, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in one of the best neighborhoods in town. Even as a kid, I remember her explaining to me how important it was to own property and build generational wealth. Someday, Eric, she'd tell me while we worked in her garden, this house will be yours. You'll raise your own family here, just like we're raising you. She'd always talk about the future, about college funds and retirement planning, about making sure our family would always be secure. When mom got sick during my freshman year of high school, she spent a lot of time getting her affairs in order. I didn't understand most of it then. I was just a scared 15-year-old watching his mom waste away from chemo. But mom was thorough about everything. She met with lawyers, updated her will, set up trusts, the whole 9 yards. The day before she died, she called me into her room. She was so weak she could barely speak above a whisper. But she grabbed my hand with surprising strength. Eric, baby, she said, I need you to remember something important. The house papers are in the safe deposit box at First National. Your name is on everything. Don't let anyone tell you different, okay? This house is yours. I made sure of it. I was crying too hard to really process what she was saying. I just nodded and promised I'd remember. She died the next morning, and honestly, the next few years were such a blur of grief that I never really thought about what she meant. Dad was completely lost after mom died. He'd never had to handle any of the financial stuff. Mom took care of all of that. He was a good man, but he was one of those guys who just worked hard, came home, and let his wife handle everything else. Without mom, he was like a ship without a compass. For about 2 years, it was just dad and me figuring things out. We weren't great at it. We lived on takeout and microwave dinners. The house was always a mess. Dad threw himself into work, pulling double shifts at the garage, and I basically raised myself. It wasn't ideal, but we were managing. Then Dad met Diane at some work conference. She was recently divorced with 2 kids and working as a real estate agent. Looking back, I can see she immediately recognized Dad as an easy target, a widower with a nice house and a good job, emotionally vulnerable and terrible with money. Their courtship was swift. Within 6 months of meeting her, Dad was talking about marriage. I was 17 and honestly just happy to see Dad smiling again. Diane seemed nice enough. She brought casseroles to our house, helped clean up, and was always super sweet to me when Dad was around. Eric, she'd coo, you're going to love having siblings. Tyler and Madison are so excited to have a big brother. The warning signs were there, but I was a teenager dealing with grief and just wanting my dad to be happy. When they got married 2 years after mom's death, I was genuinely hopeful that maybe we could be a real family again. Boy, was I wrong. The changes started almost immediately after the wedding. Suddenly, Tyler and Madison needed the 2 spare bedrooms that had served as mom's office and a guest room. Diane explained that it was important for the kids to have their own space, especially Madison, who was starting high school and needed privacy. You understand, don't you, Eric? Diane asked with that fake sweetness she always used when Dad wasn't around. They're still adjusting to the divorce, and they need stability. What I didn't understand was why my needs never seemed to matter in these discussions. My bedroom was the smallest in the house, and I'd been hoping to move into the larger spare room now that I was getting older. But those conversations never happened. Tyler, who was only a year younger than me, immediately established himself as Diane's golden child. He was athletic, popular, and had this charming personality that adults ate up. Madison was pretty and social, always bringing friends over and treating our house like it was her personal social club. Meanwhile, I was the grieving kid who spent most of his time reading or playing video games. I wasn't outgoing like Tyler, I didn't have Madison's social butterfly personality, and I definitely didn't have the instinct to compete for attention the way they did. Diane was subtle about the favoritism at first. She'd make Tyler's favorite dinner on his birthday, but forget mine entirely. She'd drive Madison and her friends to the mall but tell me I needed to find my own ride places. She'd buy Tyler new clothes for school but tell Dad that I probably didn't need anything new yet. Dad, bless him, was just so grateful to have someone taking care of the household management that he didn't see the patterns. When I tried to bring up the unfair treatment, he'd just say things like, Diane's doing her best to blend our families, or the kids are still adjusting. The financial changes were harder to track but more significant. Diane convinced Dad that they needed to combine all their finances, which meant she suddenly had access to all the accounts Mom had set up. She took over paying all the bills and managing the household budget. It's easier this way, she'd explain when Dad occasionally asked questions. I handle this stuff for a living. You just focus on work, honey. Tyler got a car for his 16th birthday. A nice used Honda that cost about $15,000. When my 18th birthday rolled around, Diane explained that the budget was tight and maybe I could start looking for a part-time job to save up for my own car. I did exactly that. I got a job at a local bookstore and started saving every penny. But somehow, my savings account, which had been set up as a joint account with Dad when I was younger, kept having mysterious withdrawals. When I asked Dad about it, he'd look confused and say he'd have to ask Diane about it later. Those conversations never seemed to happen, or if they did, I never heard the results. Despite the increasingly toxic home environment, I managed to graduate high school with a 3.8 GPA and got accepted to State University about 2 hours away. I was planning to major in business, inspired partly by Mom's financial savvy and partly by a desire to understand money well enough that no one could ever take advantage of me again. The college funding conversation was enlightening. Diane sat Dad and me down with a bunch of paperwork and explained that while they wanted to support my education, there were limits to what they could contribute. With Tyler needing a car and Madison's upcoming Sweet 16, plus the roof repair we've been putting off, we can contribute about $3,000 per semester, Diane explained. Slides of expenses spread across the kitchen table. That was generous, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover state school tuition, room, and board. I'd need loans for the rest. What confused me was that I remembered Mom talking about education savings when I was younger. She'd always said college was fully funded. When I asked Dad privately about Mom's education fund, he looked blank. I don't know anything about that, son. Diane handles all the financial planning now. If she says we can do $3,000 a semester, that's probably what we can do. So I took out student loans and worked 2 jobs through college, one in the campus bookstore, another as a tutor for business classes. I came home for holidays and summer breaks, but those visits became increasingly uncomfortable. Tyler was thriving. He'd made varsity football, had a serious girlfriend, and was being recruited by several colleges for athletic scholarships. Madison was homecoming princess and had inherited Diane's social skills, always surrounded by friends and drama. Meanwhile, I felt like a guest in what was supposed to be my own home. My bedroom had been converted into Madison's walk-in closet. I slept on a pull-out couch in the basement, surrounded by boxes of Tyler's childhood toys and Diane's seasonal decorations. It's just more efficient this way, Diane explained when I asked about the room situation. You're only here a few weeks a year now, and Madison needs the space for all her activities. I graduated college in 2018 with a business degree and about $40,000 in student loan debt. I'd done well academically and had a job offer from a regional bank in our hometown. The salary wasn't huge, $45,000 to start, but it was enough to begin paying down my loans and saving for eventually getting my own place. The plan was to live at home for a year or two while I got on my feet financially. I knew it wouldn't be ideal, but I figured I could tolerate Diane's passive-aggressive comments and Tyler's general entitlement for a while, if it meant paying off my loans faster. That's when I discovered the basement had been converted into Tyler's gaming room. His college football career hadn't worked out. Turns out he was good for high school, but not quite good enough for Division I athletics. And he dropped out after 2 semesters to figure out what he really wanted to do. What he really wanted to do, apparently, was play video games and work part-time at a sporting goods store, while living rent-free in his stepmom's house. Tyler needs this space for his streaming setup, Diane explained when I asked where exactly I was supposed to sleep. He's building a really successful YouTube channel. This could be his career. Tyler's YouTube channel had about 200 subscribers and featured him playing Fortnite badly while making sexist comments about female gamers. But Diane talked about it like he was the next PewDiePie. I ended up renting a studio apartment across town. It was tiny and took about half my take-home pay, but at least it was mine. I figured this arrangement was temporary anyway, just until I could save up enough for a real place. Living on my own meant I needed to get organized about my finances in a way I never had before. I was trying to budget for loan payments, rent, groceries, car insurance, all the adulting stuff nobody prepares you for. While organizing my important papers, I found Mom's folder, the one she'd put together before she died with all her insurance information and final wishes. I'd never really looked through it carefully before. Most of it was stuff Dad had handled with the lawyer right after she died. But there was one document I'd never seen before. A copy of a will dated just 2 months before Mom passed away. Reading through it, I found something that made my heart stop. The house, our family home that I'd been slowly pushed out of, had been left entirely to me. Not to Dad and any future spouse, but specifically and exclusively to me, Erick Thompson. According to the will, the house was placed in a trust with Dad as the trustee, with the understanding that he could live there as long as he wanted, but that legal ownership would transfer to me when I turned 25. Since I'd turned 25 the previous year, the house should have been legally mine for months. The will also mentioned education funds, a 529 plan with about $75,000 that was specifically designated for my college expenses. There were other investments and accounts too, all supposed to be held in trust for me. I'd received none of this. In fact, I had no idea any of it existed. My hands were shaking as I read through the documents. Mom hadn't just planned to leave me the house someday. She'd structured everything so that I'd be financially secure for life. The investments alone, if they'd been growing for over a decade, should have been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I immediately made an appointment with an estate lawyer. Attorney Jennifer Walsh specialized in estate planning and inheritance disputes. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that made me understand why Mom would have worked with someone like her. Your situation is unfortunately more common than you might think, Attorney Walsh explained after reviewing Mom's documents. When a parent remarries, sometimes the new spouse convinces them to make changes to estate planning that aren't in the children's best interest. She walked me through what should have happened versus what apparently did happen. According to Mom's will, Dad was supposed to maintain the house and the investment accounts in trust for me, but he wasn't supposed to have access to spend the money or make changes to the ownership structure. Based on what you're telling me about your college expenses and the current living situation, it sounds like your stepmother may have convinced your father to restructure or liquidate assets that legally belong to you. Attorney Walsh explained that we'd need to do some investigation to figure out exactly what had happened to Mom's estate, but that if assets had been misused, I might have grounds for a lawsuit. The investigation took about 6 weeks and cost me $3,000 I could barely afford. What we discovered was infuriating. Shortly after Dad married Diane, she'd convinced him that the estate structure was too complicated and that they should simplify everything. Dad, who'd never understood the legal and financial arrangements Mom had put in place, had agreed to dissolve the trust and transfer everything into joint accounts with Diane. The house had been put into both Dad and Diane's names. The $75,000 education fund had been liquidated and used for family expenses, primarily Tyler's car, Madison's Sweet 16 party, which apparently cost $8,000, and home renovations that mostly involved updating Diane's bathroom and the kitchen. The other investment accounts, which should have been worth about $200,000 by now, had been cashed out to fund Diane's real estate investment ventures. She'd bought and flipped a couple of properties, but instead of the profits going back into my trust, they'd been reinvested in more real estate that was owned entirely by Diane. In short, my inheritance, which should have made me financially secure for life, had been systematically stolen and used to fund my stepfamily's lifestyle. Armed with documentation from Attorney Walsh, I decided to confront Dad directly before taking any legal action. I still loved him, and part of me hoped this was all just a misunderstanding that we could resolve as a family. I asked Dad to meet me for lunch, just the two of us. We went to this little diner where we used to go on Saturday mornings when I was a kid, back when it was just him and me figuring out life after Mom died. Dad, I said, sliding the legal documents across the table, we need to talk about Mom's will. The color drained from his face as he looked through the paperwork. He kept shaking his head, muttering things like, "I don't understand," and Diane said this was all handled properly. Dad, did you know that Mom left the house to me? That all her investments were supposed to be held in trust for my future? He was quiet for a long time, just staring at the documents. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Son, I had no idea. Diane told me that your mom's will was simple, that everything came to me as her husband, and that we'd figure out how to take care of you as we went along. She said the lawyer confirmed all of this. Did you ever speak to Mom's lawyer directly? No, Diane handled all of that. She said it would be easier since she understands legal documents better than I do. It was becoming clear that Dad hadn't intentionally stolen from me. He'd been manipulated by Diane just as much as I had been. But the end result was the same. My inheritance was gone, and I was sitting in a diner across from my father, both of us realizing that the woman he'd married had systematically defrauded his dead wife's son. What do we do now? Dad asked, looking older than I'd ever seen him. I don't know, Dad. My lawyer says I have a strong case for recovering what's mine, but that might mean suing you and Diane. I don't want to destroy our family, but I also can't just let this go. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the magnitude of what we'd discovered. Let me talk to Diane, Dad finally said. Maybe we can work something out without getting lawyers involved. Dad arranged a family meeting for the following weekend. I was supposed to come over for dinner, and then we'd all sit down and discuss the situation like adults. I should have known it would be a disaster. Diane had clearly spent the week preparing for this conversation. She had her own pile of documents ready, and she'd coached Tyler and Madison on their roles in the discussion. Erick, she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. Your father told me about your concerns regarding your mother's estate planning. I think there's been a misunderstanding. She proceeded to explain that yes, there had been some changes to the original estate plan, but that everything had been done legally and in the family's best interest. When your father and I married, we consulted with an attorney about the best way to manage the family finances. The trust structure your mother set up was very complex and expensive to maintain. We were advised that it would be more efficient to simplify everything. More efficient for who? I asked. Because it seems like the main result was that my college fund got spent on Tyler's car and Madison's party. That's when Tyler jumped in. Dude, you gotta go to college. You have a degree and a job. Why are you complaining about a car I got when I was 16? Madison chimed in too. Erick, you're being really selfish. This is our family home too now. You can't just come in here demanding that everything be about you. Dad tried to mediate, but Diane was ready for that too. Elliot, honey, I know you want to support Erick, but you have to consider Tyler and Madison too. They've lived in this house for almost 10 years now. This is their home. We can't just uproot their entire lives because Erick is having some kind of financial crisis. The conversation went downhill from there. Diane kept reframing the discussion so that I was the selfish one, trying to take away the family home from two kids who'd grown up there. She made it sound like I was some kind of predator, swooping in to destroy a blended family out of greed. Dad, caught in the middle, kept trying to find compromise positions that satisfied no one. Maybe I could move back into the basement. Maybe they could pay me rent. Maybe we could sell the house and split the proceeds. Split the proceeds? I laughed bitterly. This house legally belongs to me. Mom left it to me specifically. I'm not looking for a compromise here. I'm looking for what's mine. That's when Diane dropped her mask entirely. You know what, Erick? Your mother is dead. She's been dead for over 10 years. The rest of us are still here, still living, still building a family together. You can't hide behind a dead woman's wishes forever. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad looked like he'd been slapped. Even Tyler and Madison seemed shocked by how harsh that sounded. I stood up to leave, but before I walked out, I turned back to address the room. You're right, Diane. Mom is dead, but her will isn't. And unlike Mom, you're about to find out what happens when you steal from the wrong person. After the failed family meeting, I stopped trying to resolve things amicably. I authorized Attorney Walsh to begin legal proceedings to recover my inheritance. The paperwork was filed, and Diane and Dad were served with notice that they were being sued for conversion of assets and breach of fiduciary duty. Dad called me crying, begging me to reconsider, but I was done. Diane had made it clear that she had no intention of returning what she'd stolen, and she'd poisoned Tyler and Madison against me completely. The legal process was going to take months, maybe years. But Attorney Walsh had identified one potential shortcut. If we could prove that the house was still technically mine under the original will, and that the property transfer to Dad and Diane had been fraudulent, we might be able to get immediate possession. It turned out that when Dad and Diane had transferred the house deed, they'd made a crucial error. They'd never formally dissolved Mom's trust through probate court. They'd simply moved assets around without proper legal authority. That meant the trust was still technically valid, and as the beneficiary, I was the legal owner of the house. Attorney Walsh filed for an emergency court order to establish my ownership, and we got a hearing scheduled for the Monday after Thanksgiving. But I didn't wait for the court order. I had other plans for Thanksgiving. See, I'd been thinking about Diane's psychology throughout this whole process. She was a narcissist who needed to be the center of attention, the queen of her domain. She'd spent years pushing me out of what was legally my own house, and she'd gotten comfortable thinking she'd won. I decided it was time to remind her that the game wasn't over. I showed up to Thanksgiving dinner uninvited. Dad had called to let me know I wasn't welcome. Apparently, Diane had made it clear that she wouldn't tolerate my presence while the lawsuit was ongoing. But I didn't need an invitation to visit my own house. I walked in through the front door with my key, the one I'd never returned because, legally, I lived there. The whole family was gathered in the dining room. Dad, Diane, Tyler, Madison, plus Diane's parents and her sister's family. About 12 people total, all enjoying the Thanksgiving feast in my house. The conversation stopped dead when I walked into the room. "Erick!" Dad started, clearly flustered. "What are you doing here? I thought we agreed—" "We didn't agree to anything, Dad. I decided to spend Thanksgiving in my house with my family." I pulled up a chair and sat down at the head of the table, Mom's old spot, the one Diane had claimed years ago. The tension in the room was incredible. Diane was staring at me with pure hatred, but she was also clearly trying to maintain appearances in front of her extended family. "Erick," she said with gritted teeth, "this really isn't appropriate. We're having a family dinner." "I am family," I replied pleasantly. "This is my house and today is Thanksgiving. Seems like the perfect time for family." For about 10 minutes, everyone tried to pretend things were normal. Diane's parents asked me polite questions about my job. Madison's cousin talked about college applications. Tyler mostly glared at me while stabbing his turkey with unnecessary violence. But I could see Diane getting more and more agitated. She kept shooting looks at Dad, clearly expecting him to throw me out. But Dad looked paralyzed, caught between his loyalty to his new family and the growing realization that he'd been complicit in defrauding his own son. Finally, Diane couldn't take it anymore. "Elliot," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "I think it's time for Erick to leave. This is supposed to be a peaceful family dinner, and his presence is making everyone uncomfortable." Dad started to respond, but I held up my hand. "Actually, Diane, since you brought up the subject of this being a family dinner in my house, maybe we should talk about family. Specifically, about what's going to happen to this family going forward." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folder of legal documents. "See, I've been having some very interesting conversations with lawyers lately. About Mom's will, about the trust she set up, about what happened to my inheritance." The room went dead silent. Diane's face was white as a sheet. It turns out that when Mom died, she made very specific provisions for my future. She left me this house, plus about $275,000 in investments and education funds. Funds that seem to have disappeared over the last 10 years. Diane's father spoke up. "Now wait just a minute, young man. You can't just come in here making accusations." "I'm not making accusations," I interrupted. "I'm stating facts that have been verified by forensic accountants and estate attorneys." I slid copies of the legal documents across the table. Several people reached for them, including Dad, who I noticed was shaking. "The interesting thing about theft," I continued conversationally, "is that it doesn't just disappear because time passes. When someone steals $250,000 from a trust fund, there are consequences. Legal consequences." That's when Diane finally exploded. "You ungrateful little bastard!" she screamed, jumping up from her chair. "Do you have any idea what your father and I have sacrificed for you? We gave you a home, we fed you, we put up with your sulking and your attitude for years." "You gave me a home?" I laughed. "Diane, you gave me nothing. This house was already mine. Mom left it to me, not to Dad, and certainly not to you." "Your mother is dead?" Diane shrieked. "She doesn't get a say in this family anymore." The room erupted. Diane's family members were shouting questions and demands for explanations. Tyler was yelling at me to get out. Madison was crying. Dad was trying to calm everyone down while simultaneously reading through the legal documents with a look of growing horror. But I wasn't done yet. "You know what, Diane? You're absolutely right. Mom doesn't get a say anymore. But I do. And here's what I have to say." I stood up and addressed the room formally. "As of Monday morning, I will be the court-recognized legal owner of this house. Dad and Diane have been served with eviction notices. They have 30 days to vacate the premises." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, Diane did something that crystallized everything I'd learned about her character over the past decade. She turned to Dad with tears streaming down her face and said, "If you loved me, you'd put the deed in my name and kick Erick out." Dad just stared at her. Then, incredibly, he nodded. "Maybe that's the best solution," he said quietly. "Erick, you're young. You can start over. Diane and the kids, they've built their whole lives around this house." And that's when I realized that Dad wasn't just complicit in the theft. He was choosing Diane over me, actively and consciously. "You know what, Dad? You're absolutely right. The deed should be in someone's name. But here's the thing. It's already in mine. I pulled out one more document. The court order that Attorney Walsh had rushed through that morning, officially recognizing my ownership of the house. This house has been legally mine since I turned 25. Everything else has just been me being generous. But I'm done being generous. I looked around the table at faces ranging from shocked to furious to confused. Diane, Tyler, Madison, you have until December 31st to find somewhere else to live. Dad, you can stay if you want, but only if Diane leaves. And all of you need to understand something very clearly. This is my house now. My rules, my decisions, my family. The rest of Thanksgiving dinner was a nightmare, obviously. Diane spent the remainder of the evening alternating between screaming at me and crying to her family about what a horrible person I was. Tyler threatened to beat me up until his grandfather told him to sit down and shut up. Madison locked herself in her room and refused to come out. Dad tried several more times to convince me to work something out, but I was beyond that point. He'd had multiple opportunities to do the right thing, and every time he'd chosen Diane's comfort over his son's legal rights. I stayed in the house that night. In my house, in what had been my parents' bedroom before Diane redecorated it. It felt strange, but also oddly right to be back in the space where I'd grown up. The next morning, Diane was gone. She'd packed a bag and left for her sister's house, taking Madison with her. Tyler was staying with a friend. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. I don't understand how it got this bad, he said when I came downstairs for coffee. It got this bad because you let someone convince you to steal from your own son, I replied. Mom trusted you to protect what she'd left for me, and instead you gave it all to a woman who saw us as marks from day one. Diane isn't like that, Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad, look at the paperwork. Look at what actually happened to Mom's money. Diane knew exactly what she was doing. Over the following weeks, the truth came out in bits and pieces. Diane had researched Dad extensively before their first date. She'd known about the house, about Mom's life insurance, about the fact that Dad was financially naive and emotionally vulnerable. Her real estate career had been struggling when she met Dad. She'd been facing bankruptcy and potential foreclosure on her own house. Marrying Dad hadn't just been about companionship. It had been a calculated financial decision. The property flipping ventures she'd used my inheritance to fund, those had been her personal business, with profits going into accounts that only she controlled. She'd essentially used my trust fund as her private investment capital. The court case was actually pretty straightforward once all the documentation was in place. Mom's will was clear and legally valid. The trust had never been properly dissolved. Dad had exceeded his authority as trustee when he'd transferred assets to Diane. Diane tried to fight it initially, claiming that she'd acted in good faith and that the improvements she'd made to the house should count toward her equity. But Attorney Walsh had prepared for these arguments. We demanded a full accounting of all assets that had been taken from my trust. When the forensic accountants finished their work, the total came to about $320,000. My original inheritance plus 10 years of growth. Diane didn't have $320,000 to pay back, of course. Most of it had been spent or reinvested in assets that were now underwater. But she did have equity in her real estate investments, her car, and various other assets that could be liquidated. The court ordered her to turn over everything she'd purchased with money from my trust, plus additional damages for what Attorney Walsh called conversion with intent to defraud. In the end, I recovered about $180,000 in cash and assets, plus full ownership of the house. It wasn't everything Mom had left me, but it was enough to give me the financial security she'd intended. Dad and I tried to rebuild our relationship, but it was never the same. He moved out of the house voluntarily in January, not because I kicked him out, but because he said he couldn't stand living with the constant reminder of how badly he'd failed Mom's memory and me. He rented a small apartment across town and tried to convince Diane to go to couples counseling with him. She refused, instead filing for divorce and claiming that he'd misled her about the family's financial situation. Tyler and Madison cut contact with me entirely. In their minds, I was the villain who destroyed their family and taken away their home. Diane made sure they understood the situation that way, painting herself as the victim of my greed rather than acknowledging any wrongdoing. Some of Dad's family took Diane's side too, particularly his sister, who felt that I was being unnecessarily harsh with my stepfamily. They're just kids, she'd say. Did you have to take away their home? But Mom's family, her siblings and parents, were firmly in my corner. They'd never liked Diane anyway, and they were furious when they learned what had happened to Mom's carefully planned estate. About 6 months after everything settled legally, I got an unexpected phone call. It was Diane, and she was crying. Erick, she said, I know you hate me, but I need your help. Tyler's been accepted to college, but we can't afford the tuition. And Madison, She's been having a really hard time with everything. She's seeing a therapist, but the sessions are expensive. I let her talk for a while. She explained that her divorce from dad had left her in a precarious financial situation. Her real estate business was still struggling. She was behind on rent for the apartment where she and the kids were living, and Tyler's college dreams were slipping away. I know I made mistakes, she continued. I know I handled things badly. But Tyler and Madison didn't do anything wrong. They're just kids who got caught in the middle of adult problems. It was a compelling speech, and I could tell she'd practiced it. But I'd learned not to trust Diane's tears or her appeals to my better nature. Diane, I said, you didn't make mistakes. You systematically stole $250,000 from a trust fund that was meant to secure my future. You spent money that belonged to me on cars and parties and real estate investments. You convinced my father to betray his dead wife's wishes. But the kids have a mother who needs to take responsibility for her choices. Tyler can get student loans like I did. Madison can go to public school and get therapy through the county mental health program. They have options. Please, she begged. I'll do anything. I'll sign papers saying I was wrong. I'll publicly apologize. Just please help my children. And that's when I realized something important. Diane was still trying to manipulate me. Even in her desperation, even after losing everything, she was still looking for angles and ways to make her problems my responsibility. You want to help your kids, Diane? Here's my advice. Get a full-time job, stop looking for shortcuts, and start acting like the parent you should have been all along. I hung up, and I never heard from her again.